The most well-known dragon in Tolkien's universe is probably Smaug or Smaug from The Hobbit, but there are more dragons, for example in the Grey Mountains, far in the north. The dwarves fought them for many years in the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, long before the events of The Hobbit. But what's their origin? It is not described in that much detail, but we know that Sauron's master Morgoth created them in Beleriand. How he exactly managed to do this is unknown. Even as one of the Valar, he can't create intelligent life, and dragons are definitely intelligent beings, even able to speak. It's possible that he altered the form of existing beings, or sent evil spirits into creatures, probably both. The first dragon, or first of the Uroloki, the fire drakes we know of, and who was called the father of dragons, is Glaurung. Interestingly, he had no wings. He first appeared in Morgoth's stronghold Angband during its 400-year-long siege in the First Age. We can read that during this siege by Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor elves, Glaurung was very young but already powerful enough to drive the elves back for some time, until the king's son Fingon started to fight him with archers. With the dragon not having fully developed his potential yet, he had to retreat, and Morgoth was not pleased that his secret weapon had revealed himself far too soon. As mentioned, Angband was under siege for 400 years in total, until Morgoth had gathered the power to overcome the siege in the Dagor Bragolach, which means Battle of Sudden Flame. Morgoth sent fire, Glaurung, now at full strength, Balrogs and orcs. It was a disaster for the elves, ending in the death of Fingolfin and Morgoth receiving several wounds in the famous duel of Morgoth and Fingolfin. Later, the men, elves and dwarves of Beleriand formed a new powerful union and together fought Morgoth again in the Nirnais Arnödiad, or Battle of Unnumbered Tears. They almost managed to beat the weakened forces of Morgoth, but his Balrogs and Glaurung intercepted parts of the reinforcements and turned the tide. Also, the Easterlings were corrupted by Morgoth before and betrayed the elves, who were in a lot of trouble now. But the dwarves from Belegost, led by the dwarf lord Azarkal or Azaral, arrived so the elves could retreat. The dragon killed Azarkal, but the dwarf lord wounded him too, and so Glaurung fled. Many elves, dwarves and men died in this giant battle. Men like Húrin or his brother Húr fought long to buy time for their allies to escape and paid the price. Húr died and Húrin was captured by Morgoth. You can imagine what's worse. And so Húrin and his kind were cursed by the Dark Lord. The story of Húrin and his children is grim, tragic and complex, so I won't tell it in all detail. It's a story for another video, but I have to mention it because Glaurung has to do with it too. But first we look at the secret elven stronghold Nargothrond. If you have watched my Sauron video, you probably heard of it. It's a fortress of an elf called Finrod, Galadriel's brother, who was king there, but he left to help Beren. Until he would return, which he never did, an elf named Orodres reigned vicariously. He was the father of Gil-galad. Túrin, the son of the mentioned and captured Húrin, was living in Nargothrond and was counselor of the king, but also brought Morgoth's curse over it. Túrin convinced the elves to abandon their tactic of secrecy against the advice of King Orodreth's daughter Finduilas, Gil-galad's sister, so they built a giant bridge, and Morgoth found out about their position and sent the dragon Glaurung, who led a mighty army of orcs to them. There are some more details, for example about Túrin's sword, but they are hard to understand without further context, and this would bring us far away from our topic, dragons. The movement of Glaurung was not unnoticed, and Túrin decided to face the dragon against the advice of Círdan, who we also know from Lord of the Rings. And so the Battle of Tumhalat began. Túrin and the elves fought against Glaurung and his army in an open field, which they were not used to. They were more used to ambush their enemies. It was a disaster. King Orodres and many elves died, but thanks to Túrin's magical dwarven helmet, at least he survived and escaped. Glaurung and Túrin, who was rallying the surviving forces, went to Nargothrond, but the dragon and his orcs arrived first, laying waste to the secret stronghold. The new bridge came in quite handy for the enemies, and Túrin had to fight his way over it. He slew everything, but was finally confronted by the mighty dragon who spoke to him. The dragon's gaze put Túrin under his spell, so he was like in trance, and so Glaurung destroyed Nargothrond and captured the survivors hiding inside, including Finduilas, who loved Túrin. Not even her screams could free Túrin from the dragon's spell. Glaurung manipulated him into believing that his mother Morwen and his sister Nienor, who he has never met, were in trouble, and that he can save them if he runs now. And when Túrin awoke, he hurried to their rescue. While Glaurung burned down Nargothrond, the captives were brought to Morgoth, but on their way the orc host and captives, including Finduilas, were killed. Meanwhile, the dragon collected everything of value and rested on the hoard he had plundered. What Túrin didn't know, his mother and sister already fled and were safe in the elvish kingdom Doriath, searching for him. They had a small host of elves and actually came quite close to Nargothrond, but Glaurung spotted them and went into the river Narog and created a vapor with a foul smell that brought confusion upon the host. Túrin's sister Nienor got lost and was found by Glaurung. He put her under a spell with his gaze and erased her whole memory, and she could not see, hear or move very controlled for several days too. She was found by the elves, who brought her back to Doriath. On their way, they were attacked by orcs. In this moment, Nienor got her senses back, but her memory was still lost. She saw the orcs and fled in absolute terror, ripping her clothes off her body while running. She ran until she passed out, close to the grave of Finduilas. Doom also led Túrin to the grave, where he found his sister, who he has never seen before, not knowing that she is his sister. Also, Nienor had never seen her brother, and she had also no memory anyway. He named her Níniel, which means tear maiden. The two became a couple and lived together in Brethil. The story is of course inspired by the Oedipus tale. Also, Níniel expected a child. But dark days were on the horizon, since Húrin's curse was still not fulfilled. One day Glaurung came close, and Túrin was still out for revenge. He sneaked under the dragon, and so Túrin thrust his black sword Gurthang, meaning Iron of Death, into Glaurung's belly, which was his weak spot. The dragon screamed out loud in pain, and the poisonous black blood burned Túrin's hand when he tried to pull out his sword, which made him fall into a coma. When Níniel arrived, the dragon awoke for one last time, taking away his amnesia spell from her and revealing that she is Nienor, sister of Túrin. In terror and despair, she cast herself down a gorge, the Kabet Enaras, into a river. Her body was never found. When Túrin awoke, his friend Brandir, who has witnessed all of this, told him what he has heard. Túrin could not believe it and killed Brandir in anger, but Níniel's identity was later confirmed to him, and he asked his sword Gurthang if he would take his blood too, and so Túrin killed himself. And if you think that's a grim story, Túrin's father Húrin was bound at the slopes of Thangorodrim. That's a group of 3 volcanic mountains on top of Morgoth fortress Angband for 28 years, and through some kind of magical vision he had to watch how the curse of Morgoth slowly ruined his children and family. In the end, Morgoth released Húrin after all those years, and he brought doom over the men, dwarves and elves that he met. He brought doom over the house of Harleth, one of the 3 houses of the Edain, but also over Doriath and Gondolin, which ended in the War of Wrath, and also brings us to our next dragon. In the end, Húrin drowned himself. The mentioned next dragon was the mightiest of the remaining dragons, Ancalagon the Black. Ancalagon was probably the first winged dragon, and obviously he could fly. His story is quite short though. He was unleashed with the other winged dragons during the War of Wrath, when the Valar were already involved, and it was not looking good for Morgoth. This winged dragon host managed to drive back the Valar and their armies, but in the Sauron video mentioned Eärendil, one of the most powerful heroes of men, even though he was half-elf and decided to live as an elf for the sake of his wife at this point, flew on his flying ship Vingilote that was blessed by the Valar to fight Ancalagon and slew the giant dragon. When Ancalagon fell, he buried the tops of Thangorodrim, the mentioned 3 volcanic mountains, under him, so you can consider that Ancalagon was quite big, probably the biggest dragon in the history of Arda. An interesting side note is that Gandalf in Lord of the Rings explains to Frodo that not even the fire of Ancalagon could destroy the One Ring. But back to the War of Wrath. There was also a dragon transporting Balrogs on his back, the so-called Beast of Gondolin. He nearly killed or trampled on Túrin's cousin and Elrond's grandfather Thrór, and the powerful elven warrior Ecthelion, who later killed Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs. But Thrór stabbed him in the foot and the beast fled in agony, killing elves and orcs with his tail. A lot of dragons died during the War of Wrath, but it seems some survived. With this, we have already spoken about 2 of only 4 named dragons in the Lord of the Rings universe. The next would be Shatha, also quite a short story. I mentioned him already in the History of Rohan video. He survived until the Third Age and probably caused the dwarves trouble in the Grey Mountains, far in the north, and he possessed a great hoard stolen from them. This brought trouble to the northern regions and a group of Northmen called the Eotheod, who were the ancestors of the people of Rohan, who settled there and built their new capital, Framsburg, there. Their leader Fram went out and slew Shatha and took his hoard, but the dwarves came and claimed it from him. And so the evil creature again created conflict even after his death. Fram was murdered, and it is rumored that the dwarves were behind it, even though the hoard stayed in possession of the Eotheod. For example, the ancient horn that Eowyn and Eomer gifted to Merry is from that hoard. It is also stated that it was made by the dwarves. Interestingly, the events in the north of the next 500 years after the death of Chatha the Worm are pretty much unknown. The next big event in the history of the Eotheod is the death of Fram's descendant Leod. And years later his son Eorl is helping Gondor in dire need, which led to Gondor gifting the Norsemen land and to the foundation of Rohan, with Eorl becoming the first king of Rohan. This is also the reason why the people of Rohan call themselves Eorlingas. This is around 3rd Age 2500 and fits perfectly because Dwarves and Dragons start to intensify their conflict in the Grey Mountains, especially with the Eotheod migrating to their new land Rohan, or the Riddermark as they call it. And so the mentioned War of the Dwarves and Dragons begins. Sadly, the description of this conflict is not very detailed. What we know is that the dwarves left Erebor at one point to migrate to the Grey Mountains because they were rich and little explored. Thorin I, an ancestor of Thorin Oakenshield, removed the Arkenstone in Erebor, which is also its origin, and brought it to the Grey Mountains too. At the same time, in the cold northern wastes, the Frodowaith were dragons, and we can read they multiplied there and came to infest the Grey Mountains, which led to the conflict with the dwarves. Tolkien never really differentiated between dragons of old and the later breeds. He also used terms like dragon, drakes and worms pretty synonymously. Some assume that those later breeds could be far lesser compared to the great dragons of the First Age, which makes some sense because, for example, Smaug was the greatest dragon of his time and most likely far smaller than, for example, Ancalagon the Black, but the dragons were still powerful and able to drive the dwarves out of the Grey Mountains after a 20 years long war. Most likely during this time the dwarves lost 4 of their 7 rings of power to dragonfire. We can also read that Dáin I and his second son Thrór were killed by a great cold drake, which is interesting because this is the only mention of a different type of drake besides fire drakes. Another interesting side note, in the Hobbit movie, Thranduil mentions that he fought dragons. This is not backed up by the books, but since his realm is pretty far in the north and close to the Grey Mountains, it is not impossible that the Sylvan Elves had to deal with dragons too. With the dwarves homeless, Dáin's third son Glaurung moved to the Iron Hills, establishing his kingdom there. Dáin Ironfoot is from this line. The oldest son of Dáin I, Thrór, that is Thorin Oakenshield's grandfather, and his uncle Bórin returned to Erebor with the Arkenstone and re-established their ancestors' old kingdom. Under King Thrór, the kingdom prospered and they gathered huge treasures. And now we are at our last dragon, Smaug or Smaug. Smaug the Golden was probably from the Grey Mountains and heard about the riches under the mountain, and so he attacked Erebor, drove all the dwarves out so he could claim the treasure, and destroyed Dale. About the consequences of this we can read in The Hobbit, where Smaug also appears. This also makes him one of the best described dragons in the Tolkien universe. We can read in The Hobbit that during the famous scene with Bilbo talking in riddles to Smaug, Bilbo was close to fall under the spell of the dragon, almost revealing himself, probably comparable to the powers of Glaurung, but maybe it was also meant in a metaphorical sense. We also learn that the dragon is very intelligent, trying to find out more about Bilbo and his plans in a battle of words, but he was also arrogant and convinced of his invulnerability, rolling to the side and revealing his only weak point, that he was probably not aware of himself to Bilbo. Interestingly, he explains that also his belly is armored and not soft as some old stories imply, which could be a reference to Glaurung. In the end, Bard used this information to kill the dragon, but also Smaug should bring conflict after his death. The dispute over his treasure should lead to the Battle of the Five Armies. Also, nobody ever dared to get close to Smaug's skeleton to collect the treasures that got caught between his scales. What an evil breed. Their scales are like an impenetrable armor, their fire breath brings death to whole cities, their greed for treasure drives them to terrible deeds, their gaze can put you under their spell, and their mind and intellect is cunning and manipulating, able to outsmart their enemies and bring them doom. The Hobbit was inspired by Beowulf, and Smaug probably by the mythological dragon Fafnir, who was also able to speak. It's maybe the case that Glaurung was the first of the dragons in Tolkien's universe, but Smaug was Tolkien's first dragon when he published The Hobbit in 1937. Thank you for watching. Some of you might have noticed that I did not mention Gostir, but he's only mentioned in the History of Middle-earth books and not part of the main books. Also, there's nothing known about him. Again, I want to thank you guys for all the support and feedback. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.